You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision. Like you fracture your radius, the radiologist pulls up the imaging, they point at that jagged white line on the screen, and the path forward is just immediately binary.
Right. The bone is broken. We set it. We cast it.
Exactly. The data just entirely dictates the protocol.
And, well, I think we find immense psychological comfort in that, that kind of categorical, visible pathology. The variables are contained.
They are. But the moment you step into the world of executive leadership or behavioral strategy, high-stakes decision-making, that entire diagnostic machinery just completely fails.
Oh, it falls apart.
Right. You can have this brilliant CEO, someone with, a flawless track record, an IQ in the 140s, and they make a catastrophic company-ending decision. And there is no MRI that can show you the fracture in their logic.
No, you're left operating in these diagnostic muddy waters, basically trying to dissect failures that are entirely invisible.
Which is precisely the landscape we are mapping out today for this deep dive.
Yeah.
The invisible architecture of decision-making.
It's a fascinating area.
It really is. And if you're listening to this right now, you are likely operating at the PhD level, or you're a senior executive navigating an environment where the right answer isn't just hidden, it frequently hasn't even been invented yet.
Yeah, you're constantly bombarded with compounding variables, and the margin for error is razor thin.
So today, we are unpacking the mechanics of metacognition. We're pulling from a really robust stack of sources. Everything from the Integrated Journal of Business and Economics, Frontiers in Psychology, Advanced Executive Coaching Manuals, and even modern military doctrine from the British Army.
It's a really diverse stack.
It is, because we're treating high performance not as some, magical innate trait, but as a highly trainable cognitive upgrade. So, okay, let's unpack this. We throw around the term metacognition in corporate seminars all the time.
Oh, constantly.
Right, but usually just as a synonym for self-awareness.
Yeah.
But the foundational literature, going all the way back to John Flavel's work in the 70s, points to something far more structural.
Yeah, Flavel's work is really the bedrock here. And you hit on a major misconception right away. Corporate seminars love that bumper sticker definition of, thinking about your thinking.
Which sounds wonderfully reflective, almost meditative, right?
Exactly. It sounds very passive.
Uh-huh.
But Flavel and later researchers like Schraw and Dennison, who developed the Metacognitive Awareness Inventory, or the MAI, they were describing an active control system.
So it's not passive observation?
Not at all. We are not talking about just watching your thoughts float by. We are talking about the deliberate capability to reflect upon, understand, and then ruthlessly regulate your own learning and cognitive processes.
Okay, looking at that MAI framework, Schraw and Dennison split this architecture into two main branches, right? Knowledge of cognition and regulation of cognition.
Yeah.
And if we treat the brain like an enterprise server, the knowledge side seems to be the system diagnostics. And it operates on three distinct levels.
Yeah, it breaks down really cleanly. First, you have declarative knowledge.
Which is essentially knowing the baseline specifications of your own cognitive machinery.
That's a great way to put it. It is the raw data of your capabilities and limitations. So a senior leader utilizing declarative knowledge isn't just generally aware of their skills. They possess granular empirical data about their performance under varying conditions.
Like knowing your own optimal operating hours.
Exactly. They know, for instance, that their capacity for a high-level pattern recognition peaks in the morning, but their tolerance for parsing dense financial matrices degrades sharply after 3 hours of continuous meetings.
Which is such a crucial piece of data to have about yourself. And then we move to procedural knowledge, which is what the repository of your cognitive strategies.
Yeah, the heuristics you deploy to process information. Knowing exactly how to run a pre-mortem analysis or how to implement a probabilistic decision tree when data is scarce.
Okay, so you have the specs, you have the tools, but then there's conditional knowledge, which the sources highlight as the absolute differentiator.
Oh, it's everything for elite operators, because you can possess a vast library of procedural tools. You can know 50 different ways to brainstorm or run a root cause analysis, but conditional knowledge is the algorithm that dictates when and why a specific tool is deployed.
So reading the room, reading the environment.
Yes. It is the capacity to understand that while a, collaborative consensus-building approach was optimal for last week's product design sprint, today's supply chain crisis requires a completely different approach.
Like a hierarchical, rapid triage command structure.
Exactly. Knowing which tool fits the specific context.
Okay, so knowledge of cognition provides the diagnostics, the tools, and the deployment criteria. But the second branch, the regulation of cognition, that's where the actual execution happens, right?
Yeah. Yes, this is the hypervisor layer.
A hypervisor. I like that. And this includes the planning phase allocating cognitive resources before you even touch a problem.
Right. And it also covers information management, which is frankly critical for our listeners right now who are just drowning in a flood of asynchronous communication and data dashboards.
Oh, man. The Slack notifications alone?
Exactly. Information management at the metacognitive level is about aggressive filtering. It is the active suppression of irrelevant data streams to protect your working memory.
Which sounds exhausting, but necessary. And the regulatory framework also includes comprehension monitoring, right?
Yes, which is basically a real-time internal audit. You're asking yourself, am I actually absorbing the subtext of this quarterly report, or am I just scanning the bold headings?
And let's be honest, usually the answer is I'm just scanning.
Right. But when you realize that, it triggers the next regulatory mechanism.
Debugging.
Okay, debugging, like fixing the code. Exactly. Debugging is the tactical pivot. It's recognizing a failure in comprehension or strategy and immediately swapping in a new procedural tool to correct it.
So if scanning isn't working, you debug by, say, reading it aloud or taking notes.
Spot on. And finally, you have evaluation, which is the post-action review, where you analyze the efficacy of the entire cognitive cycle to refine your conditional knowledge for the next time.
Okay, when you lay out that entire interconnected system, it immediately illuminates why the global leadership development industry is experiencing such a spectacular failure rate.
It really does.
I want to pull from that Kenyan MBA study featured in the Integrated Journal of Business and Economics. They cite Deloitte data showing that in 2013 alone, U.S. organizations spent $15.5 billion on leadership development.
Billion with a B.
Yeah. Yet the consensus is that roughly 75% of high-potential leadership programs yield absolutely no measurable improvement in executive performance.
The capital expenditure is just staggering, but the methodology is fundamentally flawed. Organizations obsess over the curriculum.
They optimize the content.
Right. They hire world-class facilitators. They debate the merits of off-site retreats versus asynchronous digital modules. They are optimizing the data transmission, but they completely ignore the receiver's hardware.
And the researchers in that study, they examined 314 MBA students and isolated a variable they called leader developmental readiness. And the data was just unequivocal.
It was.
The hidden predictor of whether an individual actually acquires and integrates leadership skills is their baseline metacognitive ability.
Because if you lack that hypervisor layer, if your regulation of cognition is weak, you simply cannot internalize complex behavioral frameworks. The training just bounces off.
Wow. So you can sit through a masterclass on agile decision-making, but then what?
Well, the moment you return to a high-stress corporate environment, your brain just defaults to its most entrenched, energy-efficient cognitive pathways. The training doesn't stick.
What I found particularly compelling in the literature is that this metacognitive awareness doesn't correlate with baseline intellectual ability.
No, not at all.
You can have a literal genius in the C-suite, someone who can run complex quantitative models in their head, who is entirely metacognitively blind.
Yeah, the psychological literature consistently separates raw processing power from executive control. And furthermore, metacognitive skills are domain general.
Meaning they apply everywhere.
Exactly. If you cultivate this regulatory architecture in one discipline, it transfers almost seamlessly to another. It is the defining bridge between simply possessing raw cognitive horsepower and actually knowing how to steer it.
There's an anecdote in our stack from Brian Rollo Consulting that beautifully illustrates the danger of lacking this control. And it touches on the Dunning-Kruger effect, actually.
Oh, the half-marathon story.
Yes. He discusses the decision to train for a half marathon, and his immediate reflexive thought was, this'll be easy. I have run before.
Right. He accepted that initial declarative assumption without applying any comprehension monitoring whatsoever.
He just assumed his past self was equal to this new challenge.
He failed at stage one. Metacognitive knowledge. He allowed a comfortable heuristic, the memory of past, likely way less rigorous physical activity, to mask the reality of the impending challenge.
And then reality hit him.
Hard. When he finally attempted his first training run, the physical reality completely shattered his cognitive illusion.
We smile at the marathon example because it's relatable, but, scale that up to a multinational boardroom.
It's terrifying.
Right. If a chief strategy officer settles for a default assumption about a disruptive competitor like, oh, they're just a niche startup, we've crushed companies like them before, without initiating a metacognitive debugging process.
They drive the entire enterprise off a cliff.
Exactly, because they didn't test the assumption.
And the Dunning-Kruger literature frames this perfectly. Individuals operating with significant deficits in competence fundamentally lack the metacognitive equipment required to recognize their own incompetence.
They don't know what they don't know.
Exactly. They are trapped in a feedback loop of unearned confidence, whereas highly metacognitive leaders operate in a state of perpetual self-audit. They possess an intimate familiarity with their own blind spots.
Okay, I can imagine a listener pushing back here, though.
Sure.
They might be asking, are we just rebranding mindfulness in academic jargon? Because we're talking about awareness, we're talking about reflection. How does this actually differ from the kind of executive mindfulness practices that are so popular right now?
That's a great question, and the distinction is critical and often misunderstood. Mindfulness, particularly in the context of mindfulness-based stress reduction, focuses on present moment awareness and non-judgmental observation.
Non-judgmental being the key word there.
Yes. It is the act of anchoring your attention to the immediate internal or external environment. You notice your anxiety rising, you observe the sensation, and you let it pass without attachment.
Like you're watching the weather patterns of your mind.
Exactly. Metacognition, however, is the act of seeding the clouds.
Oh, I like that.
It is highly judgmental, highly analytical, and structurally interventionist. If mindfulness is noticing you are anxious about an impending merger, metacognition is isolating the specific procedural flaw in your due diligence that triggered the anxiety, calculating the probability of failure, and deploying a cognitive corrective measure.
The sources offer a brilliant analogy from the domain of art for this. They say mindfulness is the canvas. It provides the necessary space and awareness.
Right.
But metacognitive regulation is the artist's technique. You need the canvas to paint, obviously, but awareness alone does not execute the brushstrokes required to solve a complex, multidimensional problem.
It's a perfect analogy, and to understand why that technique is not just useful but biologically necessary for survival, we really have to examine the neurobiological substrate of decision-making under extreme pressure.
Right, what happens when the stakes escalate to the point of existential threat? Let's delve into the neurobiology of the limbic hijack. Because whether you are a trauma surgeon, a military commander, or an executive facing a hostile takeover, the underlying hardware operates on the exact same primitive code.
It really does. We are essentially watching a jurisdictional battle between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Okay, so break that down for us.
While the prefrontal cortex manages our executive functions, working memory, logical reasoning, consequence evaluation, impulse control, all the high-level stuff.
The CEO of the brain.
Exactly. The amygdala, on the other hand, operating within the limbic system, functions as the brain's threat detection center. Its mandate is immediate, unreflective biological survival.
So when an individual encounters a high-stress catalyst,
The amygdala's basolateral complex initiates a massive neurochemical cascade.
cortisol, adrenaline, this standard fight-or-flight cocktail.
Right. But the critical mechanical failure here isn't just the presence of those stress hormones. It's the architectural override. The limbic hijack literally bottlenecks the neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex.
It essentially forces the executive center offline.
Completely. The system deliberately degrades your capacity for nuanced, long-term strategic thought because, well, from an evolutionary standpoint, pausing to calculate the probability of a predator's attack vector is a fatal luxury.
You just need to run.
You just run. But in a modern crisis, like a collapsing supply chain or a PR disaster, running or fighting blindly is exactly what destroys organizations.
And the literature includes EEG studies that actually map this dynamic electrically, which is fascinating.
The neurofunctional correlates are incredible. When researchers observe subjects engaged in complex planning tasks under pressure, they can identify the specific neural signatures of metacognitive intervention.
The delta power profiles, right?
Yes. High metacognitive planning correlates with highly specific delta power profiles in the left frontal cortex, particularly the AS7 region. We are literally visualizing the biological mechanism of thinking about thinking.
That is wild. And what about the people who fail under pressure?
Conversely, subjects demonstrating rigid, maladaptive decision-making under stress, the ones who cannot debug their failing strategies, they exhibit increased beta activity in those same regions.
Meaning they're locked in.
Meaning they are neurologically locked into a reactive loop.
What is truly remarkable to me is that humanity has understood this mechanism long before we had EEG machines to measure delta waves.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the most compelling documents in our stack is a piece of leadership doctrine from the Center for Army Leadership in the British Army. They utilize the Bhagavad Gita, a text that is thousands of years old, as a foundational manual for modern combat leadership.
The Gita, which is nested within the Mahabharata, presents one of the earliest and most profound case studies in metacognitive regulation.
Yeah, set the scene for us.
We have Arjuna, who is a peerless military commander, standing on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. He surveys the opposing army and realizes he is about to wage war against his own kin, his teachers, his mentors.
Talk about cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. And that dissonance triggers a catastrophic limbic hijack.
He suffers a total psychophysiological collapse. I mean, he drops his weapon, he is trembling, his skin is burning. It is a massive, acute stress response.
And Lord Krishna's intervention in that moment is brilliant because he doesn't simply issue a top-down directive to fight. He doesn't appeal to Arjuna's amygdala with some motivational battle cry.
Just do it.
Right, no. Krishna initiates a forced metacognitive pause. He guides Arjuna through a rigorous philosophical and cognitive audit.
He challenges the paradigms.
Yes, he challenges Arjuna to examine the very paradigms through which he is processing the concepts of duty, action, and identity. He forces Arjuna to step out of the immediate emotional noise of the battlefield and analyze the architecture of his own despair.
And by systematically deconstructing Arjuna's cognitive biases regarding mortality and cosmic order, Krishna actually re-engages Arjuna's prefrontal cortex.
Which is incredible, and the British Army leverages this ancient narrative to train modern officers that deep introspection in the face of chaos is not a liability. It is the absolute prerequisite for morally and strategically sound execution.
And they operationalize this today, right? Through a framework called the Combat Estimate 7 Questions.
Yes. In a rapidly deteriorating tactical scenario, the overwhelming biological instinct is to react instantaneously to the loudest stimulus. The 7 Questions protocol acts as a cognitive circuit breaker.
So instead of just reacting,
It forces the commander to sequentially evaluate the enemy's intent, the assigned mission, the available resources, and the constraints of the environment before issuing a single order.
it systematically prevents them from sprinting blindly into the fog of war.
Exactly. Former Navy SEAL Marty Strong discusses this exact dynamic in our sources when analyzing how elite special operators process chaos.
A mindstorm concept.
Yes. He describes the untrained mind's tendency to react to high pressure by overthinking in rapid-fire succession. The individual essentially internalizes the external chaos, attempting to process a million variables simultaneously.
Which just paralyzes you. So how do the SEALs counter that?
The SEALs counter this by intentionally shifting into what they term receive mode. They utilize metacognitive regulation to actively suppress the internal generation of frantic hypotheses, and they simply observe the environment as it is.
Rather than interacting with a panicked, low-resolution projection of it in their minds.
Precisely. And this extreme degree of cognitive control alters the operator's subjective experience of time.
It slows things down.
Because the prefrontal cortex is functioning with absolute clarity, unburdened by limbic interference, they process environmental data with such efficiency that the external world appears to move in slow motion.
We see the same mechanism described in the source detailing a rock climber who inadvertently scales into a route that vastly exceeds their technical capability.
Oh, that's a terrifying scenario.
Right. The automatic physiological response is panic, the amygdala screaming that a fall is imminent. But the climber utilizes conditional knowledge to recognize that panic will lead to muscular fatigue and certain failure.
So they metacognitively quarantine the fear.
Yes, they access their procedural knowledge database and meticulously construct an improvised rappel system to survive. But I have to challenge this concept of slowing down, though.
Okay, go for it.
If we transpose this to a corporate context, let's say an executive team is in the final hours of a highly contested multi-billion-dollar M&A negotiation, or, a trauma surgeon is dealing with a coding patient.
Yeah.
In these environments, speed is the ultimate currency.
It seems that way, yes.
Doesn't initiating a metacognitive pause to audit your own delta wave activity risk catastrophic delays?
It is a really common objection, but it's rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of cognitive velocity. The military axiom addresses this perfectly. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast.
Smooth is fast.
Right. When you bypass the prefrontal cortex and operate purely on amygdala-driven reaction, your initial physical or verbal response might be measured in milliseconds, but it is highly erratic and statistically likely to be incorrect.
You make a rapid decision, but it's the wrong decision.
Exactly, which means you spend the next hour or the next fiscal quarter unwinding the damage.
which is the opposite of fast.
Right. The metacognitive pause, which, by the way, in a trained individual might only require a 2-second mental check, prevents the mindstorm. It ensures that the procedural strategy you select is perfectly calibrated to the conditional reality of the crisis,
You act smoothly, without hesitation or error.
which yields a drastically faster time to resolution than the reactive approach.
This ability to maintain executive control isn't just a survival mechanism for literal battlefields, though. It is the fundamental requirement for navigating the invisible minefield of behavioral strategy.
Yes.
Because the biggest threat to sustained corporate excellence isn't usually an external competitor, it's the internal architecture of our own cognitive biases.
The transition from combat neurobiology to corporate strategy is seamless here. You see, the human brain is universally designed as an energy-saving organ.
It's lazy.
Very lazy. It relies on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to process the millions of data points we encounter daily without exhausting our metabolic resources.
Which works fine if you're, hunting and gathering.
Right. In a stable, predictable environment, these shortcuts are highly efficient. But in the complex, volatile domain of global business, they are lethal.
And the sources outline a murderer's row of biases that routinely dismantle executive strategies. Let's run through them. We have confirmation bias.
Right, where a leader subconsciously heavily weights data that supports their pre-existing strategic preference while discarding highly relevant contradictory data.
Then there's the availability heuristic.
Where decision-makers assess the probability of a risk based entirely on how easily a similar past event can be recalled to memory, rather than consulting empirical statistical models.
Anchoring bias is another big one, incredibly prevalent in negotiations or budgeting.
Oh, massively. That's where the entire strategic framework becomes tethered to the very first numerical value introduced into the conversation, severely limiting the range of subsequent adjustments.
And then, perhaps the most pervasive among senior leadership, the illusion of control.
Yes. This is the deeply ingrained belief that one's strategic acumen or sheer force of will can meaningfully influence variables that are, in reality, entirely external or random.
The paradox here is that these biases are, by definition, subconscious. They are the water we swim in.
They are.
So how does a metacognitive leader audit a system failure that the system itself is actively hiding from them?
Well, this is where the regulation of cognition moves from a theoretical concept to a disciplined, almost mechanical practice. A highly metacognitive leader does not rely on subjective feelings of objectivity.
Because feelings lie.
Exactly. They build structural tripwires into their workflow. They deploy specific procedural frameworks designed to surface hidden assumptions.
For example, the pre-mortem analysis.
A classic. Instead of asking the team, will this product launch succeed, the leader establishes a hypothetical future where the launch has been a catastrophic failure.
Right, you assume it died.
And then you task the team with working backward to identify the exact mechanisms of that failure. It mathematically bypasses the team's collective optimism bias.
They also utilize probabilistic reasoning.
Yes.
Yes.
They force their teams to abandon binary yes-no or success-failure language and instead assign rigorous percentage values to potential outcomes based on historical base rates.
This level of rigor ties into a concept the coaching manuals refer to as cognitive efficiency and strategic attention. Because a senior executive's attention is their most finite and valuable asset.
It is, yet it is under constant siege by trivial data streams.
Right, so how do they protect it?
Executive coaching frames this as auditing your cognitive portfolio. Leaders are taught to evaluate their mental expenditure with the same ruthless scrutiny they apply to capital allocation.
So treating brain power like cash.
Exactly. And they frequently discover they are burning massive amounts of high-level cognitive energy on low-value repetitive tasks that could be automated or delegated.
And by pruning that expenditure,
They preserve the metabolic resources required for genuine metacognitive oversight.
the necessity of this self-regulation was totally pressure-tested globally during the shift to remote work, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
There's a study from the International Journal of Organization Theory and Behavior analyzing 534 professionals navigating mandatory work-from-home setups.
The findings regarding virtual workspaces are incredibly revealing. In a traditional corporate environment, the physical infrastructure, the commute, the boardroom, the physical proximity of colleagues, it all acts as an external regulatory mechanism. It imposes boundaries and behavioral norms.
Scaffolds your day.
Right. But when you remove that physical scaffolding, the individual is forced to provide their own internal structure. And the study demonstrated a direct, highly significant correlation between an employee's metacognitive ability and their performance in a virtual environment.
Meaning the people with high metacognition thrived.
They did, because they actively monitored their cognitive load. They recognized when their comprehension was degrading after hours of video calls and proactively deployed debugging strategies.
Like enforcing strict boundaries between professional and personal time.
Or taking deliberate cognitive breaks. Those lacking this regulatory architecture simply allowed the boundaries to dissolve, which led to rapid burnout and degraded performance.
Look, if we return to the challenge of auditing subconscious biases, I want to dig into a specific tool mentioned in the literature, the Think Aloud protocol.
Oh, that's a powerful one.
How exactly does verbalizing your thought processes dismantle a bias?
Well, the Think Aloud protocol is a phenomenal debugging mechanism. You see, when you process a complex decision purely internally, the brain effortlessly glides over massive logical leaps and unverified assumptions.
Because the internal narrative just feels perfectly cohesive.
Right, it feels smooth. However, when you are forced to sequentially articulate every single step of your logic out loud to a peer or a team, you engage entirely different neural pathways.
You essentially force the subconscious heuristic into the light of the declarative workspace.
Precisely the effect. As you speak, you suddenly hear yourself say, "We are assuming a 15% market capture in Q3 because, well, actually, we don't have any raw data to support that capture rate. It's just a holdover assumption from the previous product cycle."
The bias becomes glaringly obvious simply by changing the medium of processing.
Exactly. And this also perfectly articulates the value of external executive coaching. A top-tier coach isn't there to give you industry-specific advice. They function as an external metacognitive mirror.
They reflect your thinking back at you.
They analyze the structure of your logic, identify the conversational anchors you are stuck on, and highlight the blind spots your internal hypervisor missed.
Okay, so managing strategic output and mitigating cognitive bias is vital, obviously. But leadership is not a purely mathematical exercise.
No, not at all.
There is an immense emotional tax levied on individuals making high-stakes decisions that impact hundreds or thousands of lives.
Massive tax.
Which brings us to a crucial intersection in the literature: the relationship between metacognition, empathy, and psychological resilience.
The traditional corporate view of resilience often equates it with endurance, the ability to simply grit your teeth, absorb the stress, and keep moving.
Right, the tough-it-out mentality.
But true psychological resilience is a highly sophisticated regulatory process. We have a study from researchers in Spain published in MDPI that used structural equation modeling to map the architecture of this resilience in 155 psychology students.
And for those unfamiliar with the methodology, structural equation modeling doesn't just look for simple correlations, right? It mathematically tests complex causal pathways between multiple variables simultaneously.
Yes, it's very robust, and the study revealed a definitive causal chain. Rigorous training in critical thinking directly enhanced the subject's metacognitive skills.
Okay.
And this enhanced metacognition, in turn, served as the primary driver for massive increases in both empathy and overall psychological well-being.
Let's dissect the empathy component first, because empathy in a leadership context is, well, it's highly complex. It is not merely a reflexive emotional resonance, feeling sad because someone else is sad.
No, the literature divides empathy into specific dimensions, primarily perspective-taking and emotional regulation.
Perspective-taking being the cognitive capacity to accurately model the mental state and worldview of another individual.
Right, it is an intellectual exercise, while emotional regulation is the ability to manage your own physiological and affective response to the emotions being projected by that individual.
The sources highlight healthcare leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic as the ultimate crucible for this dynamic. They specifically reference Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Yes. As a public health leader in an unprecedented crisis, demonstrating empathy was absolutely essential for public trust and institutional cohesion.
But if a leader in that environment operates with unregulated empathy,
if they possess high perspective-taking but zero metacognitive regulation, they will simply absorb the collective trauma, terror, and grief of the populace.
they become a sponge.
Exactly. The emotional load will overwhelm their system, resulting in vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and ultimately a complete collapse of their executive function.
So metacognition acts as the psychological blast shield.
That's a great metaphor. A highly metacognitive leader engages in deliberate perspective shifting. They profoundly understand the distress of their team or the public, but they utilize their comprehension monitoring to continuously track their own affective state.
They don't lose themselves in it.
Right. They regulate their emotional resonance to ensure they remain functional enough to deliver what the literature calls whole person care without being consumed by the crisis.
This capacity to process trauma and stress without structural damage is central to Richardson's resilience theory, specifically the concept of resilient reintegration.
Yes, resilient reintegration, because when an individual is subjected to a massive disruption or crisis, the goal is not simply to survive and return to the pre-crisis baseline. That is mere homeostasis.
Resilient reintegration means the individual utilizes the adversity as a catalyst for cognitive expansion.
Exactly. They process the trauma, extract the structural lessons, and reintegrate at a higher level of functioning with a more complex, adaptable worldview.
What happens if they lack that ability?
Conversely, individuals with profound metacognitive deficits experience dysfunctional reintegration. They survive the event, but they lack the regulatory tools to process the experience.
They just bury it.
They internalize the trauma. Their behavioral responses become increasingly rigid and defensive, and their capacity for future leadership is permanently degraded.
I want to pose a philosophical challenge to this model of regulated empathy, though.
Okay.
If a senior leader is sitting across from an employee who is in deep distress, right, and that leader is concurrently running a background metacognitive process, monitoring their own emotional state, analyzing the employee's perspective taking, regulating their affect, does that not create a profound analytical detachment? Does a highly metacognitive leader risk coming across as a clinical calculating robot studying human behavior rather than actually connecting with it?
It is a brilliant question that cuts right to the core of leadership authenticity. And the answer lies in our earlier discussion of conditional knowledge.
Knowing when to use which tool.
Exactly. A master of metacognitive architecture understands deeply that different contexts require different operational modes.
Knowing when to analyze and when to synthesize.
Exactly, the mechanism. But paradoxically, robust metacognitive regulation actually enables a purer, more profound form of empathy.
How so?
Consider the alternative. When an employee approaches a non-metacognitive leader with a crisis, that leader's unregulated amygdala instantly fires. They feel threatened, they get defensive, or they subconsciously project their own historical anxieties onto the employee's situation.
Oh, right. The leader's own emotional noise completely drowns out the employee's signal.
The interaction ceases to be about the employee and becomes a reactive management of the leader's own discomfort.
That makes total sense.
A metacognitively skilled leader, however, observes their own defensive spike, actively quarantines it, and clears the cognitive channel. By neutralizing their own internal noise, they are able to offer the employee an absolute, unclouded presence.
It doesn't feel clinical to the employee. It feels incredibly validating and grounding.
It is the ultimate expression of executive control, the ability to step completely out of your own way.
Wow. We have established how this architecture prevents strategic disaster and ensures emotional survival. But I want to pivot to the domain of alpha generation. Let's look at the ultimate competitive advantage in the modern economy: creativity, innovation, and agile problem solving.
This is where it gets really fun, because historically, the psychological literature has really struggled with the relationship between metacognition and creativity.
Why is that?
Well, there is a deeply ingrained cultural narrative that views creativity as an unconstrained, spontaneous flow state, the mythological lightning bolt of inspiration.
Abuse?
Right. And in that framework, metacognition, with its emphasis on monitoring, evaluating, and controlling, seems entirely antithetical to the creative process.
Right. It sounds like inviting an auditor to a jazz performance.
That is exactly what it sounds like. But modern cognitive neuroscience completely upends that narrative. When researchers conduct functional MRI scans of individuals engaged in high-level creative problem solving, they don't just see activity in the regions associated with divergent, unconstrained thinking.
What else is lighting up?
They observe a dual pathway activation. Simultaneously, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the neural hub for metacognitive monitoring and executive control, is highly active.
At the same time.
At the exact same time. The chaotic generation of ideas and the rigorous evaluation of those ideas are occurring in a deeply integrated parallel process.
The sources reference J.P. Guilford's seminal 1950 model of creativity, which breaks the process down to 4 distinct stages: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. We also see this streamlined in the more modern Geniplar model, which categorizes the process into idea generation and idea evaluation.
Right. And the role of metacognition varies wildly depending on which phase of the model you are in. To illustrate how crucial this regulation is when facing a complex impasse, the literature frequently cites two classic cognitive challenges: the mutilated checkerboard problem and Chinese logoglyph puzzles.
Let's walk through the mutilated checkerboard because I think it perfectly demonstrates the difference between brute force thinking and metacognitive strategy.
Sure, set it up.
So you have a standard checkerboard, 64 squares, alternate black and white. Now you surgically remove the top left corner square and the bottom right corner square, leaving 62 squares.
Okay.
You are handed 31 dominoes. Each domino is exactly the size of 2 squares. The challenge is, can you place the 31 dominoes so that they perfectly cover the remaining 62 squares?
A subject operating with low metacognitive regulation will immediately engage in spatial trial and error.
Just moving pieces around in their head.
Exactly. They mentally or physically begin placing dominoes, attempting to visualize thousands of possible configurations. They burn immense cognitive energy, hit a wall of frustration, and typically conclude the puzzle is simply too difficult.
But a metacognitive problem solver utilizes comprehension monitoring.
Right. Very quickly, their internal hypervisor flags that the brute force spatial strategy is yielding no progress. Instead of just trying harder, they step back and initiate a debugging process. They shift their perspective to look for a meta-level governing rule.
They analyze the constraints of the tools. A domino must cover exactly 2 adjacent squares.
And on a standard board, every adjacent square is a different color. Therefore, one domino must cover exactly 1 black square and 1 white square.
The standard board has 32 black and 32 white squares, but the 2 opposite corners that were removed are, structurally, the exact same color.
Let us assume they were both white. The mutilated board now consists of 32 black squares and 30 white squares.
Which means it is mathematically impossible for 31 dominoes to cover them, because the dominoes require an equal number of black and white squares.
You've solved it. The metacognitive shift from spatial visualization to mathematical logic solves the problem definitively in seconds. And the same dynamic is observed in subjects solving complex Chinese logoglyphs. They do not persist with failing strategies. They constantly monitor their progress, transform their assumptions, and rapidly iterate new search parameters.
When you scale that cognitive agility from a single brain solving a puzzle to an enterprise-wide organizational structure, you get the agile methodology.
Yeah.
The literature details how metacognitive leadership is the fundamental engine driving successful agile transformations.
Agile is fundamentally a metacognitive framework applied to software development and corporate operations.
Sprints, scrums.
Yes. It relies on short sprints, continuous feedback loops, relentless post-action evaluations, and the rapid pivoting of resources based on incoming empirical data rather than rigid, pre-planned roadmaps.
And the performance metrics are astonishing. Organizations that successfully embed agile methodologies guided by highly metacognitive leadership teams report up to a 30% increase in overall efficiency, operational performance, and customer satisfaction metrics.
They accelerate their decision-making cycles by a factor of 5 to 10.
But that acceleration is entirely dependent on the leadership team possessing what the literature defines as a creative mindset.
Correct, which requires an understanding of implicit theories of intelligence, specifically the dichotomy between an entity mindset and an incremental mindset.
A leader operating with an entity or fixed mindset views creative problem solving as an innate, immutable trait. When their team hits a massive strategic roadblock, the leader's internal evaluation concludes, "We simply do not have the creative talent to solve this." The metacognitive response is to retreat.
Conversely, a leader with an incremental or malleable mindset views creativity as a procedural skill that can be developed and manipulated.
So a roadblock is just a data point.
Exactly. When they hit that same roadblock, their comprehension monitor flags the failure not as a lack of innate worth, but as a failure of the current strategy. The metacognitive response is to aggressively search for a new procedural tool.
I do see a profound structural paradox here, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we look at the idea generation phase of the Geniplar model, the classic brainstorming session, the foundational rule is to suspend judgment. You're supposed to turn off the inner critic to allow divergent, wild ideas to surface.
True.
So if a leader's metacognitive architecture is constantly monitoring, evaluating, and filtering every thought, doesn't that inherently strangle the creative flow?
It is the defining tension of creative leadership, and it is resolved by a concept known as process monitoring theory.
Okay, what is that?
This theory posits that the pinnacle of metacognitive mastery is not the ability to maintain relentless, hypervigilant control at all times. The true mastery lies in the conscious capability to temporarily disable the regulatory systems.
Knowing when to deliberately turn the hypervisor off.
Precisely. Elite leaders recognize when they are entering the incubation or generation phase. They make a highly conscious, deliberate decision to suppress their evaluative debugging mechanisms. They allow the cognitive chaos to unfold without judgment.
They let the brainstorming run feral.
And then, crucially, once the divergent ideas are captured on the whiteboard, they reactivate the metacognitive monitors for the verification phase, ruthlessly subjecting those nascent ideas to logical and conditional stress tests.
The ability to toggle that evaluative switch on and off at will is the hallmark of advanced executive control.
It is.
That is a phenomenal insight. So we have mapped the terrain. We understand that this metacognitive architecture is the biological brake against panic, the shield against cognitive bias, the engine of psychological resilience, and the toggle switch for breakthrough innovation.
We've covered a lot.
We have. But the ultimate question for you, our listeners, is one of application. How do we build and optimize this machinery? Let's transition into the practical mastery of training the metacognitive muscle.
Well, the central thesis of the coaching literature is that metacognition is highly plastic. It is a trainable faculty. But any rigorous training protocol must begin with an uncompromising baseline assessment.
The self-audit. We discussed the metacognitive awareness inventory earlier. It is a 52-item instrument that forces an individual to rate their agreement with statements regarding their own cognitive behaviors.
Statements such as, I ask myself periodically if I am meeting my goals, or I pause to reevaluate my assumptions when I encounter confusing information, or I explicitly know when each strategic tool I possess will be most effective.
And I imagine taking that is pretty humbling.
Very humbling. Administering this inventory often shatters the illusion of competence for many executives, revealing massive gaps in their procedural and conditional knowledge.
Once that baseline is established, the coaching manuals advocate for daily structured practices. And one of the most effective, albeit initially counterintuitive for senior leaders, is the maintenance of a cognitive thought journal.
Right. And to be clear, it is not a diary of emotional reflections.
Not Dear Diary.
No. It is a clinical, data-driven log of cognitive mechanics. An executive tracks high-stakes decisions, documenting the environmental context, the perceived stress level, the primary variables considered, and the specific heuristic employed to reach the conclusion.
What happens when you do that over time?
Over a 6-month period, this data reveals profound structural patterns.
So an executive might review the data and realize, wow, in 80% of the scenarios where I was pressured by the board for an immediate answer, I defaulted to an availability heuristic, relying on recent success rather than pulling new market data.
Exactly, and you cannot debug a pattern you refuse to measure.
Once those patterns are illuminated, the leader can deploy targeted countermeasures. The literature highlights considering the opposite strategy as a potent antidote to confirmation bias.
Yes. When an executive is absolutely certain of a strategic acquisition, for example, they force themselves to meticulously document a comprehensive data-backed argument for why acquiring that company would actually be a catastrophic error.
It forces the brain to construct new neural pathways and actively retrieve the contradictory data it was subconsciously suppressing.
It really does. The manuals also emphasize the necessity of balancing optimism with rigorous realism. Metacognitive training does not advocate for cynical pessimism, nor does it tolerate toxic positivity.
It's just objective.
It trains leaders to maintain a genuinely optimistic vision for the enterprise while simultaneously running brutal objective threat assessments of the operational realities.
To truly accelerate this training, we have to look at the role of external executive performance coaching. The framework here mirrors elite athletic training. A Grand Slam tennis champion doesn't just play matches. They utilize biomechanics experts to analyze their serve frame by frame.
Exactly. And executive coaches serve the exact same function for a leader's cognitive mechanics. They establish continuous, rigorous feedback loops.
What does that look like in practice?
A coach analyzes the executive's decision-making telemetry, identifying periods of cognitive fatigue, mapping stress triggers, and highlighting recurring logical fallacies. They work collaboratively with the executive to design and install the cognitive tripwires we discussed earlier.
And there's empirical data validating this approach. The sources detail a study evaluating a specialized soft skills metacognition training program implemented across 180 employees in a large corporate firm.
The methodology was incredibly sound, utilizing a control group that received no intervention.
And the results?
The experimental group, which underwent metacognitive training, demonstrated massive, statistically significant increases in self-efficacy, their fundamental belief in their own capability to execute complex tasks.
And that internal belief translated directly to external metrics. The trained cohort exhibited demonstrably superior creative problem-solving capabilities. They adapted to rapidly changing project parameters with significantly less friction, and their interpersonal adaptability in team settings improved dramatically.
This occurs because the training elevates soft skills from the realm of fuzzy, subconscious instinct into a structured, declarative framework. When you understand the mechanics of adaptability, you can deploy it systematically, rather than hoping it magically appears during a crisis.
Leaders can also scale this architecture across their teams using the meta-knowledge questioning strategy. Instead of simply evaluating a team's final presentation, the leader interrogates the cognitive process that generated it.
They ask, deconstruct the methodology you utilize to arrive at these projections. Which data sets did you aggressively weight and which did you discard? What alternative hypotheses did you test and invalidate?
This fosters an organizational culture where the rigorous auditing of thought processes is valued as highly as the final output.
Absolutely.
If we synthesize everything we've covered today and speak directly to the senior leader listening to this right now, perhaps on a flight or commuting to the office, what is the single most effective action they can take tomorrow morning to initiate this cognitive upgrade?
The most immediate and universally applicable tool is the deliberate insertion of a metacognitive pause prior to executing the first high-stakes decision of the day.
A forced interruption of the standard workflow.
Before authorizing a major capital expenditure or sending a highly sensitive strategic communication, the leader enforces a 3-second physiological and cognitive halt. They ask themselves 2 sequential questions.
Okay, what are they?
The first is standard. What action am I about to take? But the second is the metacognitive key. How am I currently thinking about this action?
They audit the immediate state of the hypervisor.
They check the system parameters. Am I operating under severe sleep deficit? Is my perspective anchored by the previous email I read? Am I ignoring the pre-mortem data because I am eager to close the deal?
Wow.
That brief, disciplined pause interrupts the limbic drive, engages the prefrontal cortex, and fundamentally shifts the leader from a state of automatic reaction to deliberate regulation.
How am I currently thinking about this action? It is a remarkably powerful diagnostic question. We have mapped an immense amount of cognitive territory today. We have established that at the highest echelons of modern leadership, raw intelligence and domain expertise are merely baseline requirements.
To just get you in the door.
Right. The true differentiator, the ultimate mechanism of survival and growth, is cognitive regulation.
Because in an environment defined by compounding complexity, an unregulated mind is a massive liability.
Whether you are managing the visceral chaos of a combat deployment, steering an enterprise through a macroeconomic crisis, or attempting to foster breakthrough innovation in a stagnant market, metacognition is the hidden engine.
It is the architectural discipline that prevents you from becoming a casualty of your own biology and enables you to become the master of your strategic output.
It is the defining characteristic of elite performance. However, as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a provocation, a concept to independently dissect that is uniquely relevant to the immediate future of executive leadership.
Yes, let's explore that final thought. We are currently navigating the profound integration of generative AI and advanced machine learning models into the core of our strategic workflows.
It's everywhere.
Everywhere. Organizations are increasingly relying on AI to parse massive data sets, generate predictive scenarios, and even draft foundational strategic architecture. We are functionally outsourcing massive swaths of our baseline cognitive processing.
We are delegating the primary act of thinking to the algorithm.
We are. And while the AI operates as an unprecedented cognitive multiplier, processing variables at a speed we cannot comprehend, it possesses a fatal structural flaw.
What's the flaw?
It completely lacks conditional knowledge. It operates without human empathy, without an ethical framework, and without the capacity to intuitively recognize when a mathematically flawless strategy will result in a catastrophic cultural or moral failure.
It has the procedural tools, but it lacks the hypervisor.
Precisely, which leads to the critical question you must ask yourself. If the machine is executing the cognition, who is responsible for the metacognition?
That is a chilling question.
As the AI assumes the burden of generating the strategy, the sole remaining irreplaceable value you bring to the executive suite is your capacity for metacognitive oversight. You must become the hypervisor for the machine. The ultimate question is, have you cultivated the rigorous internal architecture required to regulate the artificial mind when you are still struggling to regulate your own?
That is a staggering implication to leave our listeners with. If the landscape of executive decision-making is indeed a muddy diagnostic void, metacognition is not a luxury. It is the only illumination we possess. Thank you for dedicating your time to this deep dive. We recognize the intense demands on your attention, and we trust this exploration of your own cognitive architecture will serve as a potent upgrade in the strategic challenges ahead. Until the next deep dive.